So I will be discussing Carolina Nunez Puente's article called The Yellow Hybrids, Gender and Genre in Gilman's Wallpaper. So before that, I must introduce two important people highlighted in this article. They are well-known thinkers towards the 20th century. So like Charlotte Perkins Gilman is the author of the short story The Yellow Wallpaper. She was a prominent American humanist, novelist, writer of short stories, poetry, and nonfiction, and she's also a lecturer for social reform and a leading theorist of first wave feminism. So basically, first wave feminism promoted equal contract and property rights for women, which opposed ownership of married women by their husbands, which also shows in the short story where the protagonist was restrained by her own husband. Meanwhile, Mikhail Bakhtin was a Russian philosopher, literary critic, and scholar who worked on literary theory, ethics, and the philosophy of language. He is most famous as the promoter of dialogics or dialogism. He's a philosopher who theorized on the need for a sociological poetics of literature. So, hybrid genre or cross genre is a genre that blends themes and elements from two or more different genres. But in terms of novels, hybrid novels can mean an incorporation of various storytelling methods. Like, for example, photography and poetry are mixed together. That's like one of the examples. So, for dialogism, according to Bakhtin, dialogism means the process in which meaning is evolved out of interactions among the author, the work, and the reader or listener. Also, these elements are affected by the context in which they are placed, namely by social and political forces. So basically, it creates a new meaning or interpretation based on the interaction between the author, the text, and the reader. So, but it depends on what context on what context these are placed at, because they can either be like in social or political standards, which relates to Gilman's short story, The Yellow Wallpaper. So it's like it talks about a young, depressed woman and her husband John moving to a house for summer vacation. The protagonist, Jane, has someone, like, she's actually nameless, but we just call her Jane for now. So the protagonist has some mental health issues, so her husband practically does not allow her to write or be imaginative. So her husband just tells her to stay inside the room, which has the yellow wallpaper. So the woman saw a woman, the protagonist saw a woman in the wallpaper. So basically, Jane became fascinated and obsessed with that woman in the wallpaper. So this short story was actually based on Gilman's experiences, as she also went through the same thing with her being oppressed by her own former husband. So I suggest reading this because it's kind of creepy in its own way. And then, short story is considered a hybrid in gender and genre because it depicts femininity and sexuality of the protagonist. The genre is realist and gothic because you can actually feel the dread and the mystery in this dark atmosphere. So there are actually scholars who disagree on the genre status of the yellow wallpaper, since the term genre is inconsistent in terms of its usage. Like, how does one actually define genre? To some scholars, the short story can be a diary or an autobiography or even a literature of hysteria. It can be either of those genres. So since it is classified as a diary for the story's prosaic and novelistic features, it is the yellow wallpaper is considered as the starting point of women's literature. However, to Bakhtin, that may not be the case because apparently to Bakhtin, the preferred literary exponent of dialogics was not really the novel, but only the novels of male authors. So in this article, Puente will expand on the Bakhtinian dialogics of a short story that was authored by a woman, which is The Yellow Wallpaper. And so, Bakhtin has this mindset or obsession of male authored novels that has prevented him from identifying other genres in other novels, which is unlike other thinkers who incorporated a more democratic, modern, experimental hybrid characters in short stories. So since we're talking about dialogism, Bakhtin of course needs the interaction of both readers and the author in order to create a new meaning out of the text. So Puente argues that the yellow wallpaper demands an active response reader that is able to produce a dialogical reading. She's gonna prove him wrong. So the short story's main premise is the depressed protagonist stuck inside a room, which can mean it has the dialogical criticism of the supposed stability of identity. So Gilman considered this short story as a little book. So it leads us to the question that if Puente like it leads us to the question if the short story is a realist, a gothic one, or both. But what genre does Yellow Wallpaper really fall into? So, so a Bakhtin's circle believe that genres are forms of thought, where genres are meant to reinforce the social system or criticize it the same way with novels. So, with the Yellow Wallpaper, it leads to the creation of a new genre or form of thought, which was called the dialogical feminist genre. So, in this case, Puente proves it by some dialogical analysis on the story, the narrative, and the protagonist's description of the Yellow Wallpaper. So here, like, I made some small table just to summarize the gist of Puente's analysis. So based from this analysis, the voices of the two narrators actually brought out a difference in genres and how each narrator has a genre of its own. So the young woman, or Jane, as the restrained patriarchal feminine, and the latter as the observer, the freed. So basically, the second narrator only shows up at the resolution or the ending because it becomes like a third point of view, and the second narrator is actually the voice of the author. And so, even by the protagonist describing the wallpaper's pattern, you can tell how it is interpreted based on patriarchal or social context. So, the hybrid, like the wallpaper pattern, was described as dull, impertinent, absurd, silly, has lame certain curves, and provokes confusion, which all describes femininity in social standards. So, like, the more the protagonist scrutinizes the wallpaper, the more sick or patriarchal feminine they become. So, meaning that since Jane judges the wallpaper too much, it gives us an interpretation that Jane is someone born out from how society labels them or how she was treated by the males in the story, specifically her husband and her mentioned brother. So the conclusion leads us to the attitude of Jane, giving support or proof to the argument that both realism and the Gothic are two subgenres of to which Gilman's story belongs. And so, having been well trained by patriarchy, Jane has a great ability to think in Western terms. So, like, she either thinks most rationally or she abandons herself to dreams, which she did both. So, in terms of feminism in this aspect, the second narrator or the author narrator attempts to reinvent the patriarchal language, which confirms Gilman's play with gender or genres. So, the short story has been defined as an attempt to write a new kind of story which one true to women's inner experience. So, this is like another way of interpreting that they should let the voices of a gender be listened to, not be ignored. So, in Gothic sense, they made the husband seem like a brave male savior, but he mocked the medical situation of Jane, even when he is someone of high standing. Like, of course, he's a physician. So, Gothic horror is domestic horror, family horror, and addresses precisely the gendered problems of everyday life. So, basically, the wallpaper has this. So, because of John's character, it has constructed genders through genre by saying that John was the rescuing prince helping to cure his wife's mental illness, but reality speaking, he's only restraining her. So when the protagonist acts on her imagination, John acted like how patriarchal men do. They laughed and scoffed at their own wives for being imaginative. So the young Victorian wife experiences the ideological hybrid described as the fight between the authoritative word and the inner persuasive voice. So according to Bakhtin, the authoritative voice demands to acknowledge it and binds us quite independently of any power it might have to persuade us internally, since we encounter its authority already fused to it. So this means that the voice of authority belonged to the husband, John, since he kept ordering the protagonist to stop writing or be imaginative. He just wants her to stay in the room only while he goes out to work. And that's why the protagonist Jane writes a secret diary. So while the inner persuasive voice, which is denied all privilege, backed up by no authority at all, Puente suggested that the inner personal voice was the protagonist's voice, which was still infected by John's authoritarian voice. So, like Puente suggested that the interpersonal voice should let itself be heard at times. So, what's great about this second narrator is that it was considered by the author's voice. So, the author narrator does not succumb to the gender pattern which imprisoned the protagonist in the story. So, like here are like noted genres and gender in the Yellow Wallpaper, which have been argued and debated on by scholars. So majority of the scholars agree that the central theme is feminism, due to the author's will to avoid creating a story that follows the patriarchal rules. However, scholars are still debating on the controversy whether insanity sets the main character free or not. In genre, so like school scholars argue over what genre the short story falls under. So we already discussed this, that the genre can be dialogic feminism, realist, and gothic. So traditionally, the scholars state that the mysterious woman in the wallpaper was actually Jane's own reflection. So like the reflection is a mirror of herself. And so the wallpaper's patterns was like a metaphor for patriarchal oppression which they had faced before. However, according to a post-colonial reading by Susan Lancer, Jane's yellow companion does represent another person. So this turns like to the race genre, which the yellow paper was a representation of the yellow peril. So sorry, that's yellow peril, not yellow race. So so the color yellow in the wallpaper was associated with the immigrants. So the woman behind the wallpaper was actually one of the yellow peril. Because in America during the 20th century, it was the time of like when the massive immigration occurred. So in the story, Jane sees this woman as an inferior other, which leads us to the conclusion that women do not naturally get along with each other, since there are some women who oppress other women. So Puente elaborated on the question of gender and the plurality of women by analyzing Jane's behavior. Puente noticed that the protagonist has the desire to capture the woman from the wallpaper. So this kind of resembles the first wave of feminism, which defined women mainly as white, middle class, educated, and heterosexual. So Puente encourages a dialogical reading of the short story so other readers or scholars can avoid merging white feminist consciousness, because that's basically the problem of white feminists before. They are more superior than the immigrants or people who are not white. So Gilman may be hinting in her story that it is time to change genres in order to change genders. So like genre in this context means the imaginary classifications and social parameters in the story. So which then there's also another part, genre like sexuality. Some scholars believe that Gilman incorporated a lesbian subtext. So it has been implied subtly that John might be bad at sex, and it's one of the protagonist's issues. So the imagery used to describe the wallpaper uses a lot of sexual connotations. So the way the protagonist described the wallpaper was like the color was lurid or smoldering unclean yellow. So these words are actually subtle hints at orgasm. So and then the word queer has been mentioned 3 times in the short story. So this has like prompted some readers to claim that Gilman's story is a lesbian text. So while Jane was imprisoned in her yellow room, Puente argues that maybe Jane discovers something else about her own sexuality, which may be about her non-satisfaction with heterosexual sex or her like discovery of lesbianism. So like Jane has this the first time Jane scrutinized the woman behind the wallpaper, but she became aware that it was her mistaken way of reading, and she began to understand the trapped woman in the wallpaper. So this made readers learn that instead of scrutinizing the other, we have the ethical duty of listening to them. So it's like from a third world perspective, the yellow woman appears literally more trapped than the white woman by the patriarchal wallpaper. So basically, Puente wanted to clarify that, like, since Spivak's essay on third world woman, the yellow wallpaper sympathizes with the contemporary feminists' critic, especially when it comes to the assumption of the figure the yellow figure as one of the yellow peril, which is considered as a third world woman being dominated by like first world feminism. So like basically to sum it up, the yellow wallpaper comprises more than one gender, one genre, one voice, and one ending. Like it has more than that. It does not stick to just one. So above all, the story encourages us to reinvent both genres and genders. It is like the reader's feminist dialogical responsibility to read excuse me, Gilman's dialogization of the short story as leading toward the hybridity and proliferation of genders. So basically, rather than bending to the rules of patriarchy, Gilman wanted to reform the system instead of like writing the same stories, sticking to the same patriarchal rules. So the Yellow Wallpaper is a short story that is so unique because it led away from the usual or established forms of a short story that was like commonly used back then. So like her story, the Wallpaper, is considered a hybridized fiction, which is actually a good thing.